I think that's the reason why animist is fringe. It moves in that in-between space that modern realities require to not be there.
I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today our guest is Dr. Rune Rasmussen. Rune is a historian of religion, educated from the universities of Uppsala and Copenhagen. Rune has lived in many countries and done fieldwork in a number of contemporary, primarily Afro-descendant religions, but since childhood he has had Nordic religion as a strong field of interest. Today, Rune is working on applying contemporary developments in anthropology to rethink the way we address Nordic religion, both in terms of scholarship, but also as a reservoir of cultural knowledge for environmental activism and sustainability. I think it's actually kind of perfect that we're connecting after the Yule moon, right? Like this,
yes.
We're kind of beginning, there's light maybe, there's potential maybe. So this is good that we're dropping in at this moment. What was your religious upbringing?
Well, actually, my parents are not particularly religious people, and so I didn't actually grew up religious, quite secular upbringing actually, but the kind of Christianity that we come from, or mainly come from, is a little bit of a weird animal because it's very, very widely, very important and very common in Denmark, and that is called Grundtvigianism, and that's actually, originally it's actually a kind of nationalist Christianity, which focuses very much on the Nordic past and actually inscribes the Nordic past in the Christian narrative. So, for instance, the Eddas and the stories of the Nordic gods, they used to perceive them as basically the Old Testament of North European peoples. So, and this is why I grew up very much with, my grandmother reading these ancient stories for me and so on. So.
And I know right now, or especially where you're from, the climate's extreme. So you have intense winters and a lot of light in the middle of the year. So like right now we're in that period, the November through March period of darkness. And were there things that you did growing up to maintain sanity during that time, or rituals you did as a child during those extreme light dark periods?
I don't know. I think you grow into you grow into the place you live, and then that's the normal. But I think that this experience of living in an area where light shifts that much, I think that's very ingrained and very defining for culture, and particularly I think the Christmas celebration in Northern Europe, and probably also large part of North America, the reason that Christmas is so particularly important, that has to do with the changings of light. And this is also part of the reason that Christmas continued to be so important after it was transformed from the pre-Christian Yule celebration into the contemporary Yule, which we still call it, and which is then the Christian/consumerist version. And I think the importance of these kind of cultural processes or rituals, if you will, that relies on the shifting lights.
Before you got into Nordic animism, which is, we'll be exploring maybe more animism related things today, how did you then start to wander into African and Brazilian studies? What was the main interest? What drew you there?
I think actually it was partly motivated by the realization that exactly these kinds of religion, the ones that descend from West Africa and West Central Africa, and the way that they have been renewed in New World settings in the Caribbean and South America and so on, that this has these strong affinities not connections, because these are separate traditions, but affinities, similarities, compatibilities, you could almost say, with European tradition. And there's such remarkable similarities between the ways that, for instance, pre-colonial Yoruba religiosity has moved and grown and become a thing, and what you would have found in like pre-Christian Scandinavia. So it kind of sprung out of that. I got a little bit disillusioned studying Nordic religion, because that's what I started doing. But there is a methodological problem when in the study of Nordic religion, which is that the sources that you have are really problematic. So that means that a lot of the scientific or the analytical attention goes into, for instance, questioning can we really trust this source? And often the answer is no. So can we use what this source say for anything? Well, not really. I've really felt that I wanted to approach religious knowledge, not faulty reflections of religious knowledge. And that's why I sort of moved a little bit around as I did my education, studied a little bit different things. I also actually was interested in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism during a period. But then I ended up being I think it was intellectually too tough for me. I remember waking up, sleeping, my head on the Talmud, like this, so I invested quite a lot of time, for instance, in learning how to read Hebrew and that kind of stuff. But at the end, I think my nature was a little bit more like, oh no, after that experience, I thought, no, I need something with a little bit more action. So I started learning capoeira. The Afro-Brazilian religion particularly, as I kind of superficially got to know it and realized that I wanted to get to know it more, it just struck me as this incredibly potent, incredibly contemporary, and incredibly, I almost want to use the word humanist or inclusive way of being religious, which is also incredibly traditional in the way that it's really strongly traditional polytheism. Like, we tend to perceive religion as these kind of, okay, the more, for instance, the more literally you believe in God or something like that, the more of an conservative ass you probably are. And that's not the case, actually. If you have, for instance, Afro-Brazilian religion, then these deities are literally there. They're literal realities in people's lives. Yet it is this very inclusive and erotic and in many ways queer religion that sometimes named a queer matriarchal religion. So in the beginning, I did think a lot about, oh yeah, so this also looks very much like what Nordic religion would have been. And that was part of my whole motivation to be interested in that kind of stuff in the first place.
To get us on the same page, break down those terms, how you see them, Nordic and animism.
Yeah. Well, let me start with animism. Animism is basically the idea that there are other persons in the world than just human persons, and that it's a good idea to be kind and respectful towards them. Animism is sometimes explained as the idea that there is spirit in everything. And perhaps that's not technically completely incorrect, but it also doesn't really say that much. It's much more complicated than that. Or animisms are actually rather complex ways of handling the world. And I won't get more into that. But if you meet something like the Afro-descendant religions in different parts of the world, then you see that extremely complex ways of handling very, very high voltage, charges of energy and subjectivity, which is also why you need high levels in handling them. Nordic, I could have chosen another word, which would then have given another frame to it, because animism is not really kind of, it's not organized in these boxes where there's like a system inside it, and that's Nordic animism. And then on the other side, you have another system, and that's Baltic animism or Celtic animism, and they're different from Nordic animism. That is totally not the way it's organized. Animisms are ways of relating to landscape. So what you see is, in fact, that one specific animist element can be trans-ethnic because it's defined by that landscape. So in northern Sweden and Finland, for instance, kinship with bear is a really important cultural feature. And you find it among Swedes, you find it among Finns, you find it among Sami. I have a friend he's a Swedish guy, and he studied that stuff, and it's kind of, he's figuring out how that stuff has lived on almost until the 20th century. And then you move to another part of Scandinavia, say Iceland, but there aren't any bears in Iceland, so there isn't any bear kinship in Iceland, So in that sense, even though these Swedish people living in Härjedalen in northern Sweden, they might, be linguistically closer in relation to Icelanders, they are actually having an animism that is closer related to Sami people that are their neighbors in some ways, right? So animism has these rather fluffy borders between self and other. And this was something that traditionally was actively upheld as a source of dynamism, as a source of keeping knowledge processes dynamic, and thereby reflecting changing lands and climates and conditions in order for people to keep in dynamic contact with the land. So this is just to say that when I use the term Nordic animism, then it's a kind of a problematic attempt to make one word that can sort of case in the relation to a specific landscape formation, but also there's also something cultural in it and something about cultural heritage. I think you see kinds of Nordic animism living in North American folklore traditions, and they sometimes take forms that are very characteristically Nordic in the way that these people are then reinventing themselves in relation to those areas, right? So it could also have been Southern Scandinavian animism, or west side of the North Sea region animism, or Finno-Swedish animism. But Nordic animism is also that it's easy to understand and it's easy to relate to, and that's important. Like when you're a scholar like me, it's very easy to get lost in precision. And if you get lost in precision, you easily lose the capacity to say stuff that people can relate to. And how relational are you really if people can't relate to what you're saying? And Nordic is a word that's very easily understandable for people. And it kind of makes a category that people can understand and relate to.
You're already kind of sharing it now, but can you speak about how animism in particular really supports reciprocal and meaningful relationships with non-humans and landscape?
Well, I think that's basically what animism is about. And it's almost a definition of animism, that it creates reciprocal, it inscribes humans in these reciprocal relationships with the world as a community of beings. And of course, there are a lot of technologies for how to do that. And one fundamental technology, and you see this universally in all kinds of culture, is giving and receiving, right? Mm-hmm. So you're giving something to someone in the landscape, and that creates a connection. That thing about giving, and then there's an obligation to give back, and then that creates a positive relation between persons, is a universal of human culture, and or you could also say it's a universal of person culture. So and then there are specific mediums that are very typical of giving, like food, and in specific locations around the world, you have specific mediums that really become like almost the basic gift that you give. For instance, in West Africa, the obi kola nut is a very important gift that is always shared. Also between humans, if you meet an elder or something, you share a kola nut. Among many Native Americans, you have tobacco. Among many East Africans, coffee. In Northern Europe, one particular product, which is just so incredibly important, and I'm actually planning to build up a focus on this in 2022, is beer. Beer is incredibly foundational as this sort of gift that people share in order to create relation. So this is one common thing about animism, which is a way to build reciprocity. But there are also others. This is just one simple example. Another way of building reciprocity, or building these exchange situations or relating situations, is masking. Again, is a universal thing that people do all over the planet. Put on masks in order to manifest that other than human person that a human community or a human individual is creating relation with. Because when someone is putting on a mask, then that person can create the experience of that being in actively relating. See what I'm saying? So that means that masking is one important technology in order to create relating. And then there it is specifically in agrarian Northern Europe, and I haven't studied it in details in other situations, but I'm almost absolutely certain that you can find this from Ireland through Scandinavia and probably into Ukraine and Russia and so on. And that is that something about participating in the transformations of agrarian products. So you're participating in the whole, humans are engaged in and participating in the whole life cycles, for instance, of those harvest products that are life-giving. So when the land is giving us through, for instance, producing corn to bread, then the transformation of this corn is something that humans are in very detailed ways and very careful ways involving themselves in, and every single step of the way. So even from the seeds that are going to be sown in the spring, they will be put at the Yule altar, and specific candles that have been made according to specific principles. The light of these candles will be shining on these grains, the seed that will be used in the coming spring. When it is sown in the spring, there'll be specific rituals around that are produce the fertility of the earth, basically. And when they are then harvested, there's stuff like what I think one of the most amazing hymns of Northern Europe, which is the English John Barleycorn. It's a lamentation hymn of the death of the barley, as it basically it produces the beer, and it produces then the beer as this fundamental relational vessel for connectedness in the world. So, a little bit like tobacco among Native Americans. So when the song ends, it talks about how the hunter can't blow his horn, and the tinker can't mend kettle or pot without a little barley corn. John Barleycorn, this being, this personified being, is almost like it's it's what makes the world go around, what makes everything work. And humans, so in their lamentation about the death of the harvest, also praising really how that essence of life is making life roll through the world. So this is a participation in life-giving, active human participation in life-giving transformations.
What I'm hearing in certain ways through animism, there's a certain amount of life that's channeling in the world. And through these animistic practices, we're growing ourselves just through being in relationship in some way to handle that, or to be in relationship with it rather than not. And coming to this question of eroticism, and I guess eroticism to me is a lot of just about life force, like really just like into the fullness of life. Can you speak to the place and purpose of eroticism in more traditional culture, and also just some examples of how our erotic life was related with and expressed?
Yeah, it's almost, it almost seems a bit surprising actually when you read folklore to see how central it actually was. Because it's not from a stereotypical expectation. It might not be what you would expect if you're looking at European folklore. You probably imagine virtuous women with, what do you call it, little things on their heads, and that probably people in the old days, they were just equally more conservative as they were back in time from us, but it's not the case. I think that European animisms, at least it's totally the case in Nordic animism, is very involved in eroticism. There's this very distinct feeling that the sexual encounter is life generating. So there's often there's rather explicit sexual symbolisms going on in like agrarian rituals, for instance. One of the, I think, most beautiful examples is the ancient English text called the Ækerbot, which means earth medicine. And that earth medicine invokes Mother Earth. It actually uses the term Mother Earth. I don't think I've seen that in so many places, but this Old English text, it does it, that Mother Earth, and it calls for Mother Earth to become fertile in the embrace of God. So it's actually invoking the Christian God into a cosmic sexual encounter with Mother Earth. And it's a really complex ritual. It's very much worth reading. It's called Ækerbot, like earth medicine or field medicine. So this is just one example, but I think you see it in many ways. Like, for instance, you see, I've worked quite a bit with calendar and also published Nordic animist calendar and so on. And there are these aspects where the calendar, times in the calendar, seems to be somehow gendered. That the time around January, let's begin a bit earlier. The time around December seems to have a bit of a feminine leaning. Then the time around January seems to be sort of masculine. February then seems to be feminine again. Then March is masculine again, and then April starts to become feminine again. And so there's these kind of almost a shifting of gender that goes on between the year. It's almost just an intuition when I've been sort of looking at the folklore around these months. And in this, what do you call it, like perhaps erotic tension or gender tension, not in a negative way, perhaps in an erotic way, there will also be transgressions of what we would perceive as gender normative roles. Like, for instance, you have around Yule or Christmas, there are men wearing women's clothes in ceremonial section. And that you have, for instance, around the solstice celebrations, where the Lusse, there's something called the Lusse, which is connected with the long night, the solstice. And these processions used to actually have men performing to be women. The same would be around the first new moon, actually, which in some areas was called the New King. That was the first new moon, which in the pre-Christian calendar would open the next year. And there you also have these thing about boys dressing up as girls and dancing around and doing some ceremonial stuff. And there's a lot of that stuff actually going on, which is, and also sometimes stuff that, you know, from our perspective would be rather transgressive, almost like people actually having sex, ritual sex on fields in order to kind of kickstart back into being sort of the proper life circulation of that place. And yeah, you also see it sometimes in you see it in fairy tales. You see it in myths of human to non-human relation, like totemic relations, that there's been a lot of in Northern Europe. You see that there were sexual relations between a human and perhaps a being who is human / seal or human / bear. But then the human breaks off this love bond, and that is a catastrophe. The human breaks the erotic bond, and then the world kind of becomes dangerous or perhaps even starts collapsing. And one particular myth from northern Scandinavia talks about how a woman regains this connection with her bear prince. So the protagonist of the story is this woman who then goes on this quest to get back the bear prince. Another story, this is Danish. It talks about how a woman, she's a poor woman, but she wants to, or she's getting into a position of marrying the prince. However, this prince turns into a dragon at night and eats his wives, and that's kind of a thing he does. So what she does is that she gets contact to some old wise woman or something like that, and learns how to deal with that stuff. And that is an adult rated situation. She basically takes this dragon prince through this kind of sadomasochist bed chamber torture style things, and as she gradually unveils her body, she forces him to shed his serpent hides, right? And in the end, he's just like this bloody lump of meat lying on the floor, and then she whips him with lye, and then in the end, then that actually produces the functional human connection that regains the human connection. It's so these stories are of these kind of erotic or sexual connections. I find them to be deeply mystical, actually, and very powerful. Some of them. You also find it in the ancient material, in the Eddas and so on. There's also these traces of these very intense, almost initiatory things that happens that end up opening a person to relatedness or connectedness. One ritual that I should perhaps mention here is a ritual which is probably the weirdest ritual that was ever recorded from pre-Christian Nordic religiosity, which is called, it's recorded in a text called the Velsathotter, and that it describes how people worship a horse's phallus, a preserved horse's phallus, in this humoristic ritual where that is directed by the women of the house, who are sort of, and it's sort of transgressive, and the sort of more patriarchalist leaning men of the house, they're a little bit like, oh my God, do we really have to participate in this? It's a little bit transgressive to me. And it's just, and the ritual really is for a contemporary eye, apparently has appeared so grotesque that some scholars basically think, no, this can't be true. It must be some Christian kind of judgmentalist rationalization. But the funny thing is, I actually ended up in a ritual. And if you go to my channel, you can see it. Look for the phallus and the wild goddess on my channel, because I actually participated in a ritual in Brazil that copied almost to the letter what went on in the Völsaþáttar ritual, where there was a ritual phallus that was being passed around, and the whole joke was so it was hilarious and transgressive, like bordering on abusive at times, but this phallus was kind of carried around by these transgressive female deities, or this transgressive female deity. And the funny thing was, when the heterosexual men had to drink out of this this cup that had a phallic kind of tube on it that you had to drink from, so that was sort of the joke of the whole thing. But this kind of ritual, which it has a couple of aspects. One is that it's fun, it's hilarious, and you laugh your ass, and that's a good thing in itself. But it also does something to you. It molds your subjectivity. It makes your subjectivity a little bit relational. It makes it and a little bit less touchy, I think. I think one of the problems from an animist perspective in contemporary subjectivities is that we are extremely touchy, and that touchiness kind of, I think we should go in the different direction. When you look at many animist rituals, then you see that there's a lot of like, okay, now we're gonna mold you. We're really gonna take your subjectivity or your sense of individuality, and then we're gonna do like this. We're gonna give it a proper shake-up, and by sometimes taking people through very serious ordeals. For instance, among lots of indigenous populations, you find sometimes surprisingly extreme ordeals that people are taken through, for instance, in initiation rituals.
We're habituated to fighting the other and protecting the self, but it's even more amplified these days. And what are your thoughts in terms of mythos and animism, or one or the other, in support of creating relationships with these experiences that we all will have or are having?
Yeah, well, I think we can learn a lot when we look at traditional worldviews. Like in Nordic traditional worldview, there was these two camps of beings, kind of camps, where one of them was called a Hjarnø, sometimes understood as forces of chaos, and one of them is called the gods, Aesir and Vanir, and the forces of order. Now, if you look at how these two sort of general camps are related to each other, then the most important thing about them is not their opposition. They are in some sort of opposition or tension, yeah, but the most important thing is their relation. They relate in so many ways. They relate in almost any way imaginable, going from identification, gods actually being Hjarnø, let's call them trolls in English right now, gods actually being trolls, to descending from trolls, to marrying trolls, to disguising as trolls, to playing games with trolls, also killing them and fighting them often a lot, deceiving them, employing them, being employed by them, having them as servants, perhaps being servants to them, making babies with them in all kinds of ways, loads of sexual relations between them. And so there's this extremely complicated networks between these forces that in a sense define us, and those forces that in a sense define other. Now, if you compare that to Christianity, you have angels and demons, right? Now, they are in absolute confrontation with each other. There's no, angels and demons don't make babies with each other. And if they do, then it's a demonic project, right? And what happens in the Nordic cosmos is that at some point, these relations, they collapse, and then the world ends in this cosmic clash of basically strife between those you could say, self and other. When the relatedness collapsed, then everything just the tree of life burns, and there's this cataclysm called the Ragnarok. And I think that the time that we live in now is very Ragnarokian. It's very Ragnarok, and you see this in so many ways of unrelatings that goes on in our age. For instance, the way, and one specific, I think, very general unrelating is identitarianism. We live in a very strongly identitarian age, and it seems to me that the left wing, the progressive wing, I belong to the super woke left myself, but that we have in some sense been hacked by identitarian ways of understanding that in fact belongs in the nationalist end of the kind of political spheres. And these are very strongly unrelating narratives that very much look at, they sacralize, for instance, an identity group, and transgressions between identities becomes extremely charged and problematic, and they call for very harsh reactions. So, and this is a result of these identitarianisms. Now, if you look at that, at how human culture is constructed from what I would call a traditional knowledge perspective, perhaps with inspiration from Tyson Yunkaporta. I don't know if you're aware of him, this Australian, Indigenous Australian complexity thinker. Then human culture is much more a networked thing, in fact. His example is Aboriginal Australians. Pre-colonial times, they wouldn't be like rubriced into these little boxes where there would be different tribes, and these tribes would what would actually be there would be huge areas of networks of relations between different ethnicities. People would have different languages, and there would be connections that stretched over rather large areas and into other parts of Oceania even. And you would probably see the same in any area basically in the world. Scandinavia, a continuum of different languages and or different forms of related language that are kind of merging in with people who speak completely different language, and different layers and different state formations and different kind of groups that are kind of intermingling in all kind of ways. But then at some point states emerge. Now these states, they need compliance, so they start building these nationalisms. And these nationalisms are basically the valorization of one ethnicity. So, and then instead of having these network cultural reality, you get this identitarian box-like cultural reality. Now, that thing has historically been used to, quite a lot to, for instance, oppress people in colonialism. So that means that when, for instance, you today have Black nationalism or Indigenous nationalism, then these are empowerment that are responding to this tendency. And this is also why when we are sitting here as Euro-descendants, I don't think we should pass judgments on other people's nationalisms. However, as Euro-descendants, we also have the evilest nationalisms in history. And I think it's really important that we get more onto coping with that stuff. And the contemporary identitarian left wing is not doing it good enough, I think. And I think animism can teach us something about that. I think animism can lead us in a direction where we should be able to build respectful relations. We should be able to say, okay, we use respect as the basis of, for instance, acknowledging other people's empowerment nationalisms that they do need because they have been disempowered, yet still insist on moving towards perceptions of the world that are liberated from these tools of producing compliance for states, which is basically what they are. I also think that, like I mentioned, we Euro-descendants, I mean, we have the evilest nationalisms in a sense. So we are the ones we have to deal with them. That, if we shouldn't deal with them, then who? Then who? Of course, we can't leave it to the others. It's not their job to deal with nationalism. It is actually our job. But it means, in some respects, it means posing modifications to, for instance, woke positions that are often strongly based in identitarian nationalism. And what I'm seeing, because when you're talking about, like I'm doing, you're talking about Nordic religion in online spaces, then you see a very, very intense interface where there's a lot of, not a lot, but there's some hardcore kind of racists, and then there's a huge group that are really kind of hardcore woke, queer empowerment, and really like on Black Lives Matter. And so they are interacting. And then what you sometimes see is that there's a confluence. I'm not making this up. You see white identitarians using woke language, or you see the other way. You see, for instance, woke identitarians using a word like mongrelization, which is it's a concept from the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, the fact that people who profess respectful, inclusive positions will even use a word like that. It's like saying the Aryan race or something like that. You know, it's that charged. So I think we're at a very dangerous spot, actually, historically, where we need traditional knowledge perspectives and animist perspectives to bring on some kinds of modifications to particularly the nationalist identitarianisms that I think are spreading too much, and they're spreading into places where they ought to not be.
When people are using the language of traditional versus indigenous, I've also really valued the way you delineate the two. Do you mind sharing about that as well?
Yeah, fundamentally, traditional and indigenous means the same. However, indigenous implies colonization. So that means that basically means that if you're Euro-descendant, like I prefer to not use the word indigenous because it implies the way that it's used and the way that it's needed by indigenous populations. It implies the process of colonization, and if you are a beneficiary and not in the receiving end of these processes, then there are just problems involved in using that. So that's why I use traditional. And it also, I think it has good aspects. Also, that it takes Euro-traditional knowledge or Euro-animism, and it sort of brings it out of these things, this sphere of being something where you have to have lived in the same area as your ancestors. You know, I happen to have done that, but most of us actually haven't. And if healing of some of the ruptures that are caused by the modern perceptions in this world, if that is to be achieved, then these ways of thinking, they need to be available also for diaspora Euro-descendants, like Americans and so on. And if they aren't, then it's as if then we're slipping back actually towards some of these identitarian and nationalist ways of perceiving things, and that's not going to do anybody any good. Again, this is part of the reason that I so value Tyson Yunkaporta's perspective, because his way of thinking really works at laying the ground for thinking in those directions. For instance, thinking hybridity as the normal state of humanity. Come on, we are hybrid. I often sense that there is a bit of an idealization of, for instance, from North Americans, for instance, of the unmixed old worlder. So it's as if, like, if you were Scottish and you spoke Gaelic and you wore a kilt and you live in Isle of Skye, then you're probably walking around in all cathartically, filled with, cultural identitarian self-fulfillment all the time, or something like that. It's not the case. North Europeans, for instance, we are exactly as ruptured by modernity as many North Americans, I think, if not in sometimes perhaps more, even though, you still speak a language that has stayed in this area for a long time. So I think and this is, by the way, is also something that I think we can very much learn from the Afro-descendant ways of handling the modern worlds, that they are the Afro descendant ways of for building up something like, for instance, Santeria or voodoo. These are ways that very much acknowledge and work on the basis of hybridity and mixedness and stuff being composite. There are also trends inside that which, valorize ethnic purity and, let's prance around in garbs that we imagine that pre-colonial Yoruba had and stuff like that. But the main thing is, in my view, is a very high level of working on that culturally accurate perception that humanity is hybrid, and that has to be the foundation for creating culture.
While we're in this realm, we could go to Viking washing, the term you have, as you're bringing up this kind of Isle of Skye human, Gaelic speaking. This, we have these very clean boxed ideas. So Vikings seem to potentially be another one. Will you share about that? This kind of misunderstanding, misinterpretation.
Vikings is, of course, the complete traffic accident, the idea of Vikings in many ways. And the idea was invented in the 19th century in order to produce nationalists, self-image in Denmark. In the Viking Age, Moroccan pirates could be called Vikings because they were pirates. So it was a term for, like, being a kind of coastal pirate. It didn't mean a Scandinavian in those days. And the Viking Age is a fairly short period in Scandinavian history. It's around 300 years or so. It's rather short, considering the fact that it's perhaps 4,000 years, that sort of generally the same stock of people have been living here. So, but then, so I have this huge suspicion of the whole Viking idea, and then I sense this tendency that stuff that perhaps is animist but not Viking has tended to be sort of written out of sort of the cultural canon, if you can say that. For instance, if you have the Elder Edda, which is a collection of ancient Viking Age religious poems or heroic poems, then there is one poem there which is called, I remember correctly, I think it's called the Ravngaldr Odins, the Odin's Raven chant. That song, they figured out at some point, using, I think, linguistic criteria or something like that, that it was written down a little bit later than the other ones. It was written down by some, perhaps in the 14th century. I don't remember the exact date, but it was too late to really be Viking. So it was edited out of the canon. So if you buy the Elder Edda before a certain point in time, the Ravngaldr Odins is there. It's part of the canon, But if you move up in time, then they kind of discovered that it was a little bit too late, and then it's edited out of it. Now that is Viking washing. It's taking a piece of cultural history that might be beautiful, it might be animist, it might be visionary, it might be amazing, it might be poetic, it might be philosophically deep, it might be all kinds of things, but it's not Viking. and then it is kind of edited out of the Elder Edda, which is supposed to be Viking, and a lot of it is from that period. And this particular process is one that I think you see it in various and funny ways in Scandinavia. You see this, for instance, all the ways in which animisms in Northern Europe kept transforming and a lot of the stuff that kept rolling on through history, actually, in some ways, it looks super heathen, but it's as if it has, if nobody could say, oh well, this comes from the Viking Age, then it sort of floated out and becomes marginal to our perception. And sometimes these things have lived on almost all the way down to our age. Like my friend Ole Møllerværn up in Härjedalen in northern Sweden, this bear kinship that he describes is of a kind that you can read about in sagas, and you can read about some of those rituals in these extremely, like, illustriously Viking situations where you have kings with axes and berserkers and all these kind of things. And then but when people go on doing it in northern Sweden, then it seems so unknown that it's as if, this guy just discovers and, like, what is this? This was here until my grandparents' time, and this is also, I think, or might also be an example of Viking washing. So there are many cases of this, and it's also connected to this identitarianism. So because if you build an identitarian box, one of these identitarian boxes, then you need to define what needs to be inside. One way of doing that is having the idea of an essence. The image of the Viking has been used to produce the idea of a character of North Europeans, and so it's part of saying, okay, so we have this distant past that is sort of, we are supposed to be essentially Vikings. Our essence is that we're Vikings, which we're totally not. It's totally ridiculous. If there's one thing in the world that Scandinavians are not, it's Vikings. Like, when we are at our best, which is not always, but when we are at our best, we are fairly phlegmatic people and rather feminist, and we like democracy and these kind of things. We're rather humanist and socialist and these kind of things, and we don't attack England with axes and rape kitchen girls behind the chicken coop while we're burning down the Irish convents and stuff like that. The image is absolutely cuckoo in my view. We are much, much more, if you look at who, for instance, the Danes or the Norwegians are, we are much, much more the workers' movement and the feminists and much more recent things that are, in fact, really what we are. The Vikings happened 1,000 years ago. It is so long ago, and it was a fairly short period. So yeah, I'm generally critical about this whole thing about Vikings and what it does to us. But there's also a little modification to that, and that is that I feel that Vikings, for many people out there, the image of Vikings becomes an attractor that pulls them towards an image of an authentic way of being human somehow, and that can do something positive to people. I'm also a little bit sensitive to the fact that people don't follow straight lines. They actually follow quite winding and crooked paths, and that this image might in some ways play a positive role.
Mm-hmm. Animism, at least to me, seems to have a lot of what we want. Like, it's very dynamic, it's engaged, it's co-creative, it like allows us to wander versus just be so certain all the time. There's a constant relationship that's evolving. And yet there's a lot of resistance to this, and it's been, at least in recent history, certainly on the fringe. Why is something that seems so enjoyable and expressive and enlivening something that we resist as social beings?
I think it is because a fundamental part of what is sometimes called modernity or modernist epistemology, meaning the world, the way that modern people perceive the world, how we perceive ourselves and the world. That's epistemology. And there is a structuring in that in the modern world. Now, part of that structuring is that personality is in here and meaning is in here. I'm pointing to my head now to the podcast listeners who can't see me.
Yeah, good.
Is in here. and this and out there isn't any personality and meaning and spirit and all that stuff. It's a dead machine world. This is a fundamental of the modern epistemology. Part of this modern way of perceiving is also perceiving the individual as enclosed, as a whole, as a closed whole. And anthropologists who have gone to non-modern peoples, they often find that persons don't perceive themselves as much as these enclosed wholes, but they perceive themselves much more as networks. They perceive themselves defined by their relatings and their engagements with other persons, humans and non-humans. And animism is fundamentally about, I think animism and competent animist technologies are fundamentally about bridging between that interior world of meaning and the outside world. It's as if animism happens in between these two worlds. Now, there are parts of scholarship, the ones I belong to, where we acknowledge this space, the importance of this space, where we acknowledge the dysfunction of the modern epistemology, that sharp distinction between the world of meaning and the world of dead matter. But that modern epistemology still, to a very large degree, defines, and to a deeper degree I feel I'm seeing new aspects of it all the time, how much it actually defines our social reality and academic realities in particular. And so that is, I think that's the reason why animist is fringe. It moves in that in-between space that modern realities require to not be there. So this means that when I, for instance, I'm thinking with Nordic animism, and I take my starting point completely in scholarship and scholarly perceptions, but I just very actively move into that middle space. And that means that when I move into scholarly situations, I think that this is perceived very much as fringe, because I transgress the fundamental categories of Occidental knowledge hierarchy. Knowledge hierarchy is that different kinds of knowledge have different values, and this. The concept actually comes from a Maori indigenous scholar called Linda Tuiwai Smith, who talks about how Maori indigenous knowledge has been deplaced in relation to Occidental analytical knowledge. And that same process, the deplacing of animist knowledge forms, has very much taken place among Euro-descendants. So if you talk about the concept decolonization, then I would be a little bit careful about it in a similar way as with Indigenous, because as Euro-descendants, we haven't actually been colonized. But knowledge-wise, in terms of knowledge, the implementation of knowledge hierarchies and the suppression of traditional knowledge forms and practices, in that respect, we definitely have been subjected to, if not colonization, then a similar kind of subjugation of our traditional knowledge. And that means that we can, this is part of the reason that we can actually learn quite a lot from indigenous thinkers and indigenous scholars, because they are a little bit like we have our snout pressed into the issue of nationalism. Well, they have, their snouts pressed into the issue of different kinds of domination. So, for instance, domination of knowledge is something that they have really developed tools to question, and this is something I think we can very much learn from, and then perhaps bring that stuff in from the fringe, and because there are, and there are also marginalizing dynamics that are keeping that stuff on the fringe. Like, for instance, I'm sitting on YouTube, and what I'm doing on my YouTube channel is that I have these different insights that have to do with understanding your traditional knowledge, and then I'm basically shooting them out almost as brainstormings, kind of dialogue. I just want to get it out there, get it into dialogue, but that then means that it's not impossible that you can, because it is pretty fast. If I could write of an academic article about one video that I'm making. It takes perhaps 2 days to make a video. It would take 2 years to make an academic article where I make sure that there's not one piece of data that is misplaced, where I make sure that all the references are exactly on spot, and where there's a peer review board who makes sure that everything works. Now, when I don't do that, you see, I actually risk maintaining the marginalization. I risk reproducing that people could be saying, well, this is this hippie stuff there, which is completely fluffy and it's unsound scholarship or something like that. I actually make this way of thinking a little bit vulnerable. Now, so if I was at a university, then perhaps nobody would hear about me, but then on the other hand, I would actually be able to build that way of knowledge as in an academic system. So you see, there's a marginalizing, a self-upholding, marginalizing dynamism in this way. Did that make sense? The whole thing I said here?
It totally makes sense. Yeah,
Okay.
and I'm thankful that you're so courageous. Like, you're not like talking about.
Thank you so much.
But it's true, though. Especially I just hear about it. The academic world is rough. There's a lot of, it's not necessarily like people supporting each other, and this kind of, once again, this relational experience of how do we all kind of share and be heard. And I just really value that you're kind of creating, through what you're doing, you're creating a pathway for other people to also allow there to be a brainstorming together, versus like needing each of us to know exactly the way forward, or exactly what we're talking about, imperfection, right? Like undeniable, based on certain undeniabilities that are not even necessarily things we want to be basing our knowledge on or being supported by. So
yeah, totally. And I actually think, like, even from an analytical perspective, I think working in this rather loose way, compared to using 2 days to shoot out a perspective, compared to using 2 years to make a peer-reviewed academic article, working in this rather loose way, I think it has a lot of value, actually, because it strings knowledge together in a different level, and that I think that makes for new perspectives. Academic knowledge, the way it's constructed today, has extremely tight and extremely deep focuses. But if you look at something like the book I published on Nordic animist calendar, then it has a, for lack of a better word, holistic perspective. It looks at the whole year, and I think that perspective actually gave me insights, rather important academic insights. So I actually think that the playful, almost trickster-like, playful way of thinking with this stuff. I think it ought to be able to be useful also from a scholarly perspective.
Mm-hmm. Will you share about what you are doing, like the calendar? You have the totem. This, and you have some new things also arising right now. Just pathways that you're supporting people to be engaged in Nordic animism.
Yeah, I'm generally trying to move from talking, thinking, blah 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 space, and trying to move into spaces of practice, because animism is in fact more something you practice than something you think about and realize and know about. And that, I think that this also accentuates some of the problems, for instance, scholarly problems in what I'm doing, and make them sort of, more pressing somehow. So one thing I've been doing is I published a calendar, basically, which is this is inspired by indigenous strategies for how to uphold and reproduce traditional knowledge in these wheel of seasons structures that different indigenous peoples use to renew and maintain traditional knowledge in relation to passing seasons. So I basically tried to do the same with North European traditional animism. I wrote a little book that sort of followed the whole turning of the year, and I'm publishing a calendar every year where you can see, okay, so today is, the Fire Day, Yule, or whatever, or all these holidays all around the year that had been largely forgotten, many of them, and which all had these funny and deep and powerful animist rituals connected to them. So that's one thing I did. Now, you see, the focus is trying to get into practice, something that people can use as an inspiration for what they do about seasonal ritual. So that's one thing. Then I actually anchored a seasonal ritual in Copenhagen, which is called the Yule goat or the Yule buck. I'm not sure exactly what the right word is in English, which basically looks at some of what I mentioned earlier, this idea that animism is about typically masking and engagement. And then we're looking at some of these traditional forms of masking that used to define the Yule season, and basically trying to renew them into our contemporary urban space. So again, it's a practice-focused project. And then there is the raven flag, which that was actually a super Viking thing originally. But then I looked at the raven symbolism in North European cultural history and found that it had these very strong totemic motifs that are very similar to what you see in raven totemism actually around the planet, particularly in North America, around the Northwest Pacific Native Americans. Very, very similar motives in the raven totemism. So I took out these motives that are motives of land connectedness. It is kinship between humanity and someone in the landscape, raven, right? So, and then I basically launched it as the raven flag into eco-activism, and people are taking this symbol to heart. The point of it is to articulate and bring out the animist land connectedness meanings in a piece of traditional European culture. So these are just a couple of examples of where I'm trying to reach from this thinking space and into practice space.